Imagine waking up to a sound that doesn't belong, not the settling of a house foundation or the sound of a refrigerator, but the distinct, terrifying friction of a sliding glass door being eased open, inch by painstaking inch. It is 3 a.m. The darkness of your bedroom, once a sanctuary, has transformed into a cage. You reach for your partner, only to be blinded by the beam of a flashlight cutting through the gloom. A voice, guttural and clenched through gritted teeth, whispers a script that will haunt the nightmares of an entire state for decades. Scream and I'll kill you. This wasn't a horror movie. For residents of California in the 1970s and 80s, this was a living, breathing reality. They were hunting a phantom, a man who could slip into homes like smoke, terrorize families for hours, and vanish without a trace, leaving behind only trauma and baffling clues. He had many names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. But history would come to know him by a name that captured the sheer breadth of his terror: the Golden State Killer. This is the story of a monster who operated with impunity, the detectives who spent a lifetime chasing a ghost, and the revolutionary breakthrough that finally brought justice from the shadows of the past. This is the case that didn't just make headlines. It rewrote the rulebook of criminal investigation forever. To understand the magnitude of this case, we have to step back into the sun-drenched golden haze of California in the mid-1970s. This was the era of unlocked doors and neighborhood block parties. Suburbia was the American dream realized: safe, manicured, and predictable. But in Visalia, a quiet town in the San Joaquin Valley, something was rotting beneath the surface. It started small. A local prowler known as the Visalia Ransacker was breaking into homes. But he wasn't stealing valuables. He was stealing intimacy. He would rifle through underwear drawers, scatter family photos, and take trinkets of no monetary value: a single earring, a piggy bank, a cufflink. It was psychological warfare. He was letting them know, I was here. I touched your life. In 1975, the Ransacker escalated. He shot and killed Claude Snelling, a journalism professor who caught him trying to kidnap his daughter. Then, just as the heat turned up, the Ransacker vanished. Months later, hundreds of miles away in Sacramento, a new nightmare began. The East Area Rapist emerged. The modus operandi was so specific, so calculated, it baffled law enforcement. He targeted single-story homes in middle-class neighborhoods. He would stalk his victims for weeks, learning their schedules, peering through their windows, and even breaking in beforehand to unlock a window or unload a gun left on a nightstand. When he struck, he was a force of total control. He would wake couples, blinding them with a flashlight. He would force the woman to tie up the man with shoelaces he brought himself. Then came the most chilling detail of all. He would stack dishes or teacups on the bound man's back. If I hear them rattle, he would whisper, I'll kill everyone. The psychological cruelty was unparalleled. He would eat the family's food, drink their beer, and terrorize the woman while the man lay helpless, terrified to move a muscle, listening to the agonizing silence of his own home. For the investigators, the case was a descent into madness. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, yet it pointed nowhere. They had shoe prints, hundreds of them, from a specific brand of tennis shoe. They had ligatures. They had descriptions of a man in a ski mask, ranging from 5'9" to 6'0", sometimes with blonde hair, sometimes brown. But the most frustrating aspect was the offender's preparation. He seemed to know police procedure. He knew how to avoid leaving fingerprints. He knew escape routes through creek beds and canals that didn't appear on standard maps. He sometimes called his victims months after the attack, breathing heavily into the phone or whispering, "Gonna kill you, bitch." Red herrings plagued the investigation. Was he a student? A construction worker? The polished nature of his knots led some to believe he was military or a sailor. His agility suggested he was young. One of the most haunting moments occurred at a town hall meeting in Sacramento. Police were trying to calm a terrified community. A man in the audience stood up, aggressive and agitated, demanding to know why the police couldn't catch him. He interrupted the speakers, flexed his dominance, and belittled the investigation. Years later, investigators would wonder, was the predator in the room that night? Was he feeding on their fear, getting a high from the very meeting meant to stop him? By 1979, the attacks in Northern California stopped. The East Area Rapist, like the Ransacker before him, seemed to evaporate. Then the killing started in Southern California. The original Night Stalker was brutal. He no longer just assaulted. He bludgeoned and shot couples to death in their beds. Lyman and Charlene Smith in Ventura. Keith and Patrice Harrington in Dana Point. The violence was escalating, but because jurisdictions didn't share data effectively in the pre-internet age, nobody connected the dots. They thought they were hunting two different men, a rapist in the north and a serial killer in the south. The human cost of this case stretched far beyond the crime scenes. Victims lived in perpetual terror. Marriages fell apart under the weight of the trauma. Survivors checked closets every night for decades. The community changed. The era of the unlocked door was dead. For the investigators, the case became a personal demon. Detective Paul Holes of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office inherited the case files, boxes upon boxes of misery. He spent years staring at the sketches, visiting the old crime scenes, trying to get into the mind of a ghost. Why did he stop? Did he die? Was he in prison for another crime? The psychological profile suggested a man who needed power. He was likely a loner, socially awkward, perhaps holding a grudge against authority. But he was also disciplined. He could turn his compulsion on and off. This wasn't a frenzied maniac. This was a calculated hunter. A massive breakthrough came in 2001 when DNA technology finally linked the East Area Rapist crimes to the original Night Stalker murders. The authorities realized with horror that this was one man. One monster who had committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries across the entire state of California. The Golden State Killer was born. Decades passed. The case went colder than cold. The files turned yellow. The evidence lockers gathered dust. The monster was likely an old man now, if he was even alive. He had gotten away with it. Enter Michelle McNamara. A true crime writer and journalist, she became obsessed with the case. She coined the name Golden State Killer and wrote vividly about the hunt, keeping the story in the public eye. Her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, reignited global interest. Tragically, McNamara passed away before she could see the end of the story, but her work kept the pressure on. But the real twist, the one that would change history, came from an unlikely source. A genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter and Paul Holes. They had the killer's DNA from a crime scene, but it didn't match anyone in the CODIS criminal database. The killer had never been arrested for a felony, or at least not one where his DNA was taken. Holes had a radical idea. What if they didn't look for the killer? What if they looked for his family? They uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database used by people to find long-lost cousins and build family trees. It was a long shot. They weren't looking for a criminal. They were looking for third or fourth cousins who had innocently spat into a tube to learn about their heritage. The system pinged. They found distant relatives. The investigation moved from the streets to the spreadsheets. 5 investigators spent months building massive family trees, going back to the 1800s and then moving forward, branch by branch. They were looking for a specific needle in a haystack. A male, born between 1945 and 1955, who had lived in Visalia, Sacramento, and Southern California at the exact right times. The tree narrowed, branches were pruned, suspects were eliminated. Finally, the tree pointed to one man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was 72 years old. He lived in a quiet suburb of Sacramento, not far from where the terror had begun. He had a manicured lawn. He was a grumpy neighbor who yelled about loud noises. He built model airplanes. And the most shocking twist? He was a former police officer. The man who knew how to avoid fingerprints, who knew police response times, who knew how to bind victims with professional knots. He had been one of them. He had been an officer in Exeter, near Visalia, and then Auburn, near Sacramento, during the very height of the crime sprees. He had been patrolling the streets by day and hunting the citizens by night. The realization sent shockwaves through the task force. The fox had been in the henhouse the entire time. Surveillance teams set up outside his house. They watched an old man shuffle to the curb to put out his trash. They needed his DNA to be sure. They waited until he left his car in a public parking lot and swabbed the handle of his door. It was a match. On April 24, 2018, police swarmed his home. When DeAngelo walked out of his garage, looking confused and frail, the officers tackled him. He looked up, his eyes wide, and whispered a phrase that betrayed his surprise. "I have a roast in the oven." It was the banal, ordinary protest of a man who thought he had outsmarted history. After his arrest, the frail old man act began. In court, DeAngelo appeared in a wheelchair, mouth agape, feigning a catatonic state. He looked like a confused grandfather, but the investigators knew better. In his interrogation room, when left alone, he was seen moving vigorously, pacing, and climbing on furniture to check for cameras. The evidence was undeniable. Faced with the overwhelming DNA proof, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping, as the statute of limitations on the rapes had expired, to avoid the death penalty. But the true resolution didn't come from the judge's gavel. It came from the survivors. During the sentencing hearing in 2020, the courtroom was packed. For days, victim after victim and the children of the murdered stood up. They looked the monster in the eye. They stripped away his power. They detailed the resilience they had built, the lives they had lived despite him. One survivor looked at the slumped, pathetic figure in the wheelchair and said, "The boogeyman is gone." DeAngelo, finally forced to speak, muttered a hollow apology. "I am truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. It meant nothing. The victory was that he would die in a concrete box, stripped of his name, known only as inmate ADU-2877. The capture of the Golden State Killer did more than close a cold case. It revolutionized criminal justice. The technique used to catch him, genetic genealogy, was a Pandora's box that, once opened, could not be closed. Almost overnight, cold cases that had sat dormant for decades began to tumble. The grim sleeper, the confused identity of the boy in the box, the killers of helpless teenagers in the 80s, investigators across the globe began using the Golden State Killer technique to solve the unsolvable. Joseph DeAngelo thought he was a ghost. He thought he could outrun the past. But he forgot that we leave pieces of ourselves behind, not just in our actions, but in our very blood, and in the blood of those who share our name. The hunt for justice is long, and sometimes the trail goes cold. However, as this case proved, science, persistence, and the refusal to forget can shed light on even the darkest, deepest corners of history. What do you think? Does the use of genetic genealogy in privacy-sensitive databases justify the means if it catches monsters like DeAngelo? Or is it a slippery slope? This case changed the world. But the debate is far from over. If you found this story gripping, please hit that like button. It helps us share these important stories with a wider audience. Subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the criminal underworld, and share this story with a friend who loves true crime. Let me know in the comments, which cold case do you think genetic genealogy should solve next? Until next time, stay safe and keep the lights on.